I would now like to introduce our next panel of really august CIOs to help us. I think we have an amazing distinguished CIO panel where, first of all, I'd like to welcome Stuart Mason, who is the Associate Vice President and Chief Investment Officer of the University of Minnesota. And I've had the distinction of working with Stuart. How long has it been? 13 years?
Yeah,
14 years?
14, yeah.
14 years. So it's been a long and a fruitful journey, and I'm super excited for for what holds next for us. So thank you so much for making it, Stuart. So
thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Jonathan Hook, who is the Chief Investment of Harry and Jeanette Weinberg Foundation, and he is responsible for managing the foundation's investment portfolio. And I had the distinction of being on the podium with Jonathan at the NMS conference, where we spoke on the same topic. And then, of course, we have Tim Recker, who is the Chief Investment Officer of the Irvine Foundation. So thank you all for making it today, and it's great to have you. So before we get into machine learning, I want to talk to you about kind of what is happening at the higher education thing. So endowments, what are the challenges that endowments are facing in terms of their spending targets in today's low return endowments and in today's low return environment? And kind of what investment strategies are you looking at? Are you looking at particularly to achieve those targets? And we keep hearing about Yale and Harvard having to support 33% of their operating revenue. And I know, of course, with inflation, your targets are more than 8%. So Stuart, maybe you can take that first.
Well, I think in this low-rate environment that's been persistent until just the last few months, really, for the last number of years, the search for institutional quality investments that can allow us all to make the 7.5% or 8% nominal that keeps up with inflation, adds a little, and lets us do the 4.5% or 5% payout. I mean, that's the challenge, and it's gotten more challenging. So I think it's caused all of us to look more broadly at opportunity set, and both in geography, meaning global search, as well as different asset classes. And there has been an evolution in asset classes that are institutional quality over the last couple of decades. Certainly the venture capital and private equity have expanded dramatically. We all see the numbers, and we see how much capital is flowing into those more traditional alternative asset classes. But there's a variety of new things. It might be life settlements or litigation finance or royalty stream investing. Those are just a few.
Great.
Yeah, I think Stuart hit on a lot of it, and apologize, I'm getting over a sinus infection, so hopefully my voice is carrying out there. Before I came to the foundation, I was at The Ohio State University, and one of the problems, which Stuart didn't mention, that many, not all, but many public universities have, is the issue around freedom of information. And probably the hardest thing for me to do while at Ohio State was try to do due diligence and invest in a venture fund, because typically the question would come up: are you a FOIA participant? Do you have to give information if someone asks for it? Yes. Sorry, we're not interested. So it was a great relief and a great joy to come to a foundation and not have that. So that's been something that we have gone after. And after a long hiatus in Ohio with venture, we've been able to turn more to venture and other asset classes, with similar issues that are more interesting. And I think, again, to Stuart's point, staying out of the fairway, trying to go where maybe not as much capital is flowing, but more niche investments. So finding things a little bit off the run certainly are more interesting.
Tim, you were at a public institution which had a great venture program, and now you're at another amazing institution.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sympathize with the public records issues at the University of California Regents. We were able to generate very good venture returns despite the public records, but I think it's because we are based here in the Bay Area. It would be very difficult otherwise. We were able to do significant diligence and back firms and still generate good returns, but you're fighting with one hand behind your back. And I think now in an organization where we're a private organization and based here in the Bay Area, one of our key competitive advantages is our access to venture. And so 25% of the entity is venture capital, which is a major departure from most of our peers. And the good news is most of that is very high quality venture. And so I think when we think about our ability to generate long-term returns, that's one angle. The other component is running a concentrated portfolio. So we believe that in order to sort of combat a lower return environment, we have to have a conviction-based portfolio where we really concentrate into the people that we have the highest conviction in. And so 25 managers across all asset classes account for almost 80% of our portfolio, and my goal is to take that to 90. And within those managers, they're generally concentrated. And so our goal is to have it really be about individual stock selection to fundamentally drive our returns, not just absolute market returns.
That's great. So I know this is a question. Yesterday we had a crypto panel, and I think I heard maybe 4 or 5 times the notion that cryptocurrencies were an asset class. Of course, Fidelity just announced a fund, and I had one of the board members of a blue chip asset manager call me saying, Alex, we want to talk to you, and want your advice. We're launching a cryptocurrencies business. So what do institutional investors like yourself think of it? Will a Sequoia with a Matt Huang or a Andreessen Horowitz take you kicking and screaming into this space, or do you see cryptocurrencies as a legitimate asset class?
Are you going first?
I can do that. We're looking at it. We're studying it. We've got one person on the team who's kind of the designated researcher, if you will, and he's very active bringing things to the rest of the team and talking about it. But as far as seeing a fund or a structure, we won't say fund, but some sort of structure in which to invest in it, we've not at this point. And I think as much as anything, it's trying to take the pulse of our board and make sure that we're not going too far from what might let them not sleep at night, and make sure that volatility isn't breathtaking or too breathtaking, up or down. So I think it's something we're putting time into, but still catching our information as we go.
I mean, I would say we're also studying it pretty hard, but as we all know or have all seen, there's many different elements of crypto, different layers of technology and the way it's applied, different verticals where it is utilized and so forth. And so our strategy to date has been expand the capability of some of our more knowledgeable venture funds, where they're seeing a lot of the newer applications or the newer pieces of that complex puzzle. And to do so also with a couple of our hedge funds that might be in small amounts, just trading currency or participating in an ICO or something like that. I think we've avoided thinking about a dedicated fund just because what we see is, to date, has been a lot of volatility, a lot of misunderstanding that sometimes translates to an inefficient market, but I'm not so sure that the volatility in the whole realm of cryptocurrency is so much inefficiency as just other other influences outside just the normalization of the products. And so we haven't done a dedicated fund, and probably I don't foresee us doing that in the near future. But dipping our toe in the water through hedge funds and through a little bit of exposure in some of our venture funds.
Tim,
Yeah. I would say we've actually, it's very similar, spent a lot of time looking at it. We have a designated person on the team who's actually attending, a crypto conference probably every 2 to 3 weeks. We've actually met with most of the major hedge funds that are in this space that are well known. We've met with anybody that has a dedicated capital pool that I think is credible. I think we've, for the most part, been meeting with most of them. And so I think that there's two layers to it. The first is we don't think it's an asset class. The first layer is let's understand it so we can understand what our managers are doing. And the second layer is, do we want to make dedicated investments in this space and dedicated vehicles? And what we've learned so far is, our managers are taking, and about almost every one of our managers has amended their documents to allow for anywhere from 10 or 15% of their funds to invest in crypto/blockchain. So if we have 25% venture in our portfolio, by definition, we're going to have at least probably 1% of the entity in crypto at some point in the future. And so that's not insignificant. And this, the implementation of that by the different partners, I would say the quality is very different. Some are making what I call a Vegas bet, where they're willing to put in a small portion of their fund and just pray that it's a home run. Others are actually looking at it as a disruptive technology that could be the next wave of innovation, et cetera. And so you have to really separate the currency from the blockchain. And from our point of view, we're not willing to invest in the currency from a view that it's going to replace gold or be a value in and of itself as a currency. We view it as an equity ownership stake in blockchain companies and a component to that ecosystem and potentially a disruptive ownership structure to traditional equity funding of companies. And so I think that's what we're trying to spend our time and understand is really how it impacts blockchain companies and the equity structures.
So Coinbase, I think it was day before yesterday, announced a service for institutional investors to invest directly with them. Instead of charging you whatever, 1 basis points or 4 basis points that Vanguard charges, they're charging you 2% to buy, to do any trade. So I guess knowing, from the comments of this panel, institutional investors are not banging down Coinbase's door to give them money to buy Litecoin and Bitcoin. So that's great. Now coming back, to and something Stuart, you said, and this recurring theme is as you look for returns, and even indirectly, much of the innovation, the venture returns that we've gotten have been through either international companies like Spotify and Klarna, which are in portfolios of U.S. funds, Adyen, or directly with endowments and foundations investing outside the U.S. Now that U.S. is taking under the Trump administration a much more isolationist viewpoint, how does that impact your thinking and your portfolios, and how are you thinking about this?
I think the trend, Alex, over the last couple of decades, as we've mentioned earlier, is much more emphasis on idiosyncratic types of investments. This certainly means all of us are expanding pretty dramatically what we're doing in the private sectors of the portfolio. For many of us, that private or locked up structure represents 40%, in our case 50% of the overall. So there's a very rich collection of possibility when you're taking the long-term view and can withstand some of the illiquidity in a portfolio like many endowments and foundations can. For us, I think it isn't just the Trump administration playing isolationist, but we have been very actively seeking what I think are emerging or at least newer centers or hubs of innovation or new ecosystems developing. In venture, for example, the world not only is China developing its own venture activity very dramatically, but when you think about what's going on in Berlin or in London these days, or in a number of other locations around the world, in Israel, for example. I mean, there's just great new venture activity hubs there. In private equity, which is in many cases a bigger portion of our portfolios, London again is emerging as lots of private equity managers. One area that we've found really interesting of late, and we're kind of surprised by, is the private equity activity in the Nordic countries. And there's some fabulous managers there, in MENA, in sub-Saharan Africa. There's lots and lots of new areas that have really been coming out of the woodwork, and I think in our minds at least representing very viable sources of potential return that are different from the more traditional US-based managers in each of those two asset classes.
That's great. It's, the opportunities are not coming to the capital is going to the opportunities. Yeah, that's great. Tim,
you want?
Yeah, so I've historically had a viewpoint that, venture is very difficult to really be competitive outside a few areas, and even just really a handful of cities globally. And I think it's been Silicon Valley and China are the two that I think have the most advantages. I think, New York, Boston, LA, others, they've ebbed and flowed. And I think, my thinking may be changing in a sense that I think, technology is disrupting to the point that it democratizes the ability that you don't just need an entrepreneurial culture. Because I think what makes the Bay Area so special is just the entire culture and the atmosphere and the ambiance around people going to companies, et cetera. And I think it's, the barriers to entry for that to happen from a cultural point of view and an ecosystem to succeed are lowering. And so to Stuart's point, I think you're seeing more opportunities that are viable on a global basis. We have one of our managers in Europe on venture and one in China. Both have generated exceptional returns. I don't think we're going to be the investors going to go and seek out those new viable investments, just because the caliber of investments that we have in venture will probably be a little more patient. But the risk we run by doing that is missing the next great manager that could emerge in different markets.
And the way we've thought about it is, when I moved to the foundation a couple of years ago, we had nothing in private equity or venture. So the thought of what do you do from a standing start, and how do you get this kicked off? And one of the options was, to go to Sand Hill Road and knock on a lot of doors and get in line, and maybe in several years or a couple of funds, you might get a small piece of someone's fund who's really good. That didn't make a lot of sense. So what we really focused on was looking for newer, smaller managers and trying to find next generation folks who have spun out of good shops. And, as good as Sequoia and several other names may be, let's focus on newer, smaller folks. So so far we think it's working well. Obviously there's many years before you really see a lot of marks put on the board. So we're still very nascent in the approach. I think we're up to all of 4% in illiquids. And from the foundation standpoint, we have no cash flow coming in. So somewhere between 40 to 50% of the portfolio in illiquids is about the right number. Unfortunately, over 40% of the foundation's assets have been real estate. So we're trying to play with a portfolio that is shrinking on one side, growing on the other. And over time, we'll get to the right mix. But at this point, we're still very small in the venture and PE space.